From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will talk about determining the dry down rate of corn heading into harvest. He'll share what a new K-State field project has indicated about that rate and discusses why you growers need to monitor this closely. Then, excerpts from the latest Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. This time, K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell will discuss cover crops as a grazing resource for the cow herd, and they'll go over guidelines for proper handling of vaccines. Later, this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Raymond Cloyd identifies several beneficial insects active now in home landscapes. All of it next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome once again to another Agriculture Today. Corn harvest is underway very modestly in Kansas, but with recent weather, that harvest progress has been slowed considerably, so the bulk of the harvest certainly still remains ahead. And with the moisture that's come in the last 3 weeks, the question of how rapidly that corn crop will dry down comes up, and producers are wondering how that might progress as they think about their harvest timing. Lending some insight on that now, crop production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Ignacio Ciampitti. Now, in some parts of Kansas, dry down wasn't much of an issue 3 or 4 weeks ago, but most assuredly it can be now throughout a fair part of the state, Ignacio.
Yes, and as always, Eric, thanks for the invitation
to
talk about this topic. Dry down is a relevant topic, and the information that we have on dry down is not very abundant. When you start looking at information from corn on drying down, most of the data goes back to the 80s. The dry down is connected to specifically a couple things. One is what were the growing conditions until plant is maturing, reaching black layer. And the second one is what are the weather conditions from that point until harvest. And why we are very interested in this process is because this can really help us to time harvest. Mm-hmm. We are always saying that we are selling volume. So when we are selling basically corn, that is a dry matter, but at the same time, we want to sell the harvest commercial content, 15.5% of grain moisture. So that means that if we go below that number, right, and if we are harvesting with less than that number, we are harvesting less water, so we are harvesting less volume, so we are getting less profit. So that's the importance, establishing the importance of why we really want to be on time to harvest. And understand this process is one of the keys.
The pivot point then is that black layer before and after. So what can we draw from what happened ahead of black layer in making this determination?
Well, if we go back, we might need to go back at least maybe a month. So if we start looking at the weather conditions from the last month of August across the state, we start seeing situations that are very, kind of on a split. Northeast area, above normal temperatures when you see about the central western part of the state, below normal temperature. That gives you some information about potential speed for that crop to reach black layers. So we know for sure that maybe northeast and most of the crop and central part of the state, whatever make it to grain, most surely will be in black layer or is in black layer right now. On the western part of the state, we might be still at least far away on some of those fields just because of the temperatures that we have during the month of August. And what black layer means, to establish the concept, is a moment that basically stop depending from the plant. So we know that the grain is being filled at the end of the season, and some of that carbon, some of that nutrients is coming specifically from the plant, right? So black layer is at the bottom of the kernel. in corn. When black layer form means that the plant that grain does not depend anymore from any of the resources from the plant. So basically we say the kernel and the grain is independent from the plant. From that point on, what happened to that kernel, it will not be depending on specifically any stress or any problem that the plant has, but it's depending on the weather.
Mm-hmm. The environment surrounding.
The environment surrounding. And there is a big point that is the relative humidity around the ears, around those kernels, is one of the big factors. And one of the processes that we like to study, and we decided to study, was the idea of how fast, how soon we go from black layer to the moment that we would like to be, 15.5% grain moisture. And then another quick concept before we get to the rate of desiccation is water content. Many times we don't tend to think too much about grain moisture, but when we start 15, 20 days after flowering time in corn, that kernel that is initiating is 90% is all water, nothing else. So the thing that will happen to that kernel from that moment, 15 days after flowering until black layer, is just an exchange of, water by starch by dry matter, okay? So it will be gaining in dry matter content until the point that we call the black layer. So main question that we usually tend to have is at what grain moisture level does the corn reach black layer? The answer, as everyone good agronomist, is it depends.
Right.
It's really hard to say a specific number. Many times we discuss in corn that number is around 35%. Okay, so we say when that kernel is reaching 35% grain moisture, most likely it will be in black layer. So if you notice, I say most likely. So that means that there are situations that kernel might reach black layer before with a high water content or below with a very low water content. And those two scenarios are coming from two things. One is that, as we have seen this year in some of the sections in our state, some of that corn really rush up into maturity. And some of that stress corn was reaching black layer with a really high water content. So really didn't maximize the dry matter, never maximized that. And then there was some corn that it might reach in black layer with a very low number of grain moisture. And those situations are when you have an excellent growing conditions. And most likely, when you look at our state at this point, the central part, western part, if we have more temperature, I think that we'll get into that situation. So we now know, have some information about what is average grain moisture for black layer. 35%, and we want to get this kernel to 15%. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how many days?
And that relates back to largely, once again, the environment, including humidity and temperature. And
exactly. So temperature basically helps in the sense of, if we have warm temperature, it will help that kernel to desiccate faster. Precipitation, is connected to relative humidity. So precipitation basically depends on the water content of that kernel. There might be some situations that it will be re-wetting. So maybe that kernel could re-wet and get a few extra points of moisture content. Similar to the relative humidity. If you relative humidity, there is a kind of a equilibrium point between the relative humidity in the year and those kernels and the environment. If you are below, there will be compensation and there will be some re-wetting. A few points. So that means that the desiccation rate is slow. So we have a study looking at grain filling during the end of the year in corn. This study was, done here in Manhattan, and then the idea was just to look at what happened what happened after black layer. So we established the black layer with 36% of water content in the kernel, and then we start monitoring that kernel every 3-4 days. And the goal was just to establish that slope. What is a slope until we get close to 15.5%? As we know, from 36% to 15%, we have around 20 points. So the main question is how quickly we can lose those 20 points of water. And then from that specific example, we are losing, on average, in 23 days, that was the duration of the dry down, we lose almost close to 1% per day. So just to give you an estimation, and this was one specific weather condition, so again, this can change with temperature, weather condition, and the humidity of the kernel. But in this specific situation, we were able to, in 20 days after maturity, we were able to be at harvest time.
Now, that's a general number you want to stress.
And
right?
that's a general number. To be honest, I mean, this 1%, sometimes it might change. I have seen situations, for example, that could be 0.5% if the weather is not conducive. I mean, if you have, like, saying, very low temperatures, or if you have high relative humidity. Or I have seen desiccation rates of 2%, which means that you might be today saying, okay, my kernel is black layer. In 10 days, you need to harvest. The main message, I mean, is this depends at this point from the environment. So we are developing some models. We are working on trying to get some models to start using the weather environment and weather conditions to predict harvest time. That's what we are working also today is how well are we predicting the black layer. Mm-hmm. My idea, our exercise is to ask farmers to get out and to look at those kernels and to start, looking at how they can time harvest, because putting priority on those fields that they are basically with problems. I mean, if it's a stock rot or if it's lodging or if it's any issues, when you are already seeing those issues, putting priority to make sure that you harvest those fields first, because they will desiccate faster and they will have problems on picking up those corn. And making sure that any corn that is ready, just to get it out of the field as soon as possible, because we start seeing conditions, that they will be good for mold issues, fungus, so we start losing quality once we leave the corn in the field. So the idea of this exercise is really to make sure that all the things that we did in order to protect that corn during the entire growing season, make sure that we can recover the maximum profit possible by selling the maximum volume.
If you'd like to read more about this topic, there is a good article on it in the E-Update newsletter series out of K-State Agronomy, the rate of dry down in corn before harvest, and some things you can consider as you go about determining when harvest time is at hand for your corn stands this year. Ignacio, as always, thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric, for the invitation.
That from crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Ignacio Ciampitti. That newsletter, once more, at agronomy.ksu.edu. That article in the September the 7th edition, this past Friday. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, another podcast entry from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. It's called the BCI Cattle Chat. Each week we share a portion of the latest podcast with you. Around the table this week, K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson and livestock economist Dustin Pendell. Brad tells us what's on the slate this time around.
Today we want to touch on cover crops, and as we come into fall, vaccine handling is really important. It's time to start thinking about fall, and some people are thinking about their grazing. We had a little conversation before we got on the air about cover crops and some of our various experiences with those. And Bob, you had a story you wanted to tell, or?
Well, I guess I have to be a little careful because I don't claim to be much of an expert on cover crops. This is an issue or a topic that you're certainly hearing about the last few years. And I've had some neighbors that planted cover crops, and sometimes they really started doing it more because of what they were hoping to get benefit from crop production.
From row crop production.
But they used a seed blend that was good for cattle grazing, and they were very pleased with it. As they said, and this would have been a couple of years ago when they first had the experience, and they said, the rains came just right, and they were very pleased with the cost effectiveness of using cover crops as forage production, following well into the winter. Now, my understanding, talking to some of the same people, is different years, different rainfall, you get a different amount of production. And so there's certainly some year-to-year variation as you would expect. But the couple of friends that I know that are using it are learning more each year, trying different seed varieties or seed combinations. And I think they see it as a long-term addition to the way that they both crop farming and cattle, but they're in the process of learning.
The thing that's been interesting from some of the folks that I've talked to, and as you look at some of the information that's out there, really started on the crop side as an agronomic solution for some of the issues there, either tying up nutrients or making sure we have weed control or erosion control in the crop field. And then it's evolved to where we look at the opportunity for increased grazing time out there. So cattle that may be grazing corn stalks or bean stubble or things like that, there's the opportunity to put something else out there for them to eat, which may have benefits for the crop ground as you go forward. And Dustin, you said you'd talk to somebody
I was
too.
sitting at a baseball game this summer, and the guy sitting next to me is kind of from northeast Kansas, has some cows, and he made a comment that he's done this in the past and it's worked really well, but this past year, he said with the drought that he thought maybe the cover crops sucked up some of the moisture, which then had some impacts on the crops. But it was this one year. Again, the weather played an important role, but he made the comment that he had them in the past, and he was definitely using them, and I suspect he probably will continue. But it is interesting to think about all the different aspects. I know we're starting to do quite a bit of research here, especially down the southeast part of the state with Jamie Lynn, who's in the Department of Animal Sciences, starting to do some research on that as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of work done at K-State in the agronomy department, really looking at some of the soil fertility aspects. But yeah, some of the folks in animal sciences are starting to look at how best to utilize these cover crops for grazing, and some of them have the potential to have high nitrates and some other issues that we as veterinarians are interested in. And so it's an area where, to me, it's kind of fun to learn something new. And
now's the time to think about it, because many of those may have a 45 to 75 day time to maturity. So some of them are planted this time of year, depending on what crop they're going behind. I've seen people will fly them in, or they'll wait till after the crop's harvested and then seed them. So you have different opportunities there, but I think you have to plan out what are my goals. And like many other things, you decide, is my primary concern to get forage mass for grazing, or is my primary concern for erosion or weed control, or where is it? Because there's lots of different mixes available.
And one quick comment, if you're thinking about this and you want to think about putting some kind of numbers to it, if you go to agmanager.info, there are cover crop budgets out there. So I know Jamie Lynn and a couple folks from Ag Econ and even an agronomist put together some budgets for cover crops.
So you could plan out, if I'm going to put in a cover crop, here's what I think my expenses and my returns would be.
And I believe there's even cattle component into where they're looking at grazing that.
The other thing that we wanted to talk about, and Bob, I'll ask you a little bit about it. It's coming up on that time of year. We're going to be vaccinating calves. We've talked about some of the vaccines that we would use. What we have not discussed is vaccine handling. So if I go purchase some vaccines, or in fact, if I order them online and they come to my house, or I go to my vet and pick them up from the vet's office, what do I need to think about once I get them home?
Well, and this question comes up every fall, and a lot of times when I'm talking to other veterinarians, they've got stories where vaccines have been mishandled, and so they really didn't have any value. So you went to the expense, and
why would they not have value?
Well, if they've lost their ability to get a good immune response from the cattle, then you run the cattle through and you poke them with a needle, but you don't really get the protection that you need.
So mishandling, how would that make them not work?
One of the key ways that vaccines can be mishandled is temperature. So if you read any of the bottles or boxes, it'll tell you a range that temperature that the vaccine needs to be held. That's particularly true if you're using a modified live vaccine. They have a pretty narrow temperature range that's necessary to keep those viruses alive or modified live.
So they have to replicate to stimulate that immune response. So if they die off.
So really high temperatures and really low temperatures can really negatively affect those. Now, some of the other vaccines, some of the bacterial vaccines and some of the killed viral vaccines are a little more stable, so they've got a wider range of temperature that they are safe to handle, but they still have a range, and you can get them too hot or too cold and cause problems. And so really for any of the products, being aware of the temperature range, can't just leave them outside. The other areas, so temperature is really important, but then UV light again. So a lot of times we talk about once the vaccines, particularly those modified live vaccines that come with a pellet, a dried pellet, and you mix it with a liquid. Once you've mixed those up, then it's very important to keep the bottle and the syringe out of direct sunlight, and keep them in a temperature-controlled area. So a lot of times what that really is a cooler, an igloo cooler, something like that. And so
do you mean even while you're working the cattle?
Yeah,
I can't just set it on the table next to the chute and have it sitting there?
Well, if you do that, you're going to start to decline the ability of that vaccine to provide good protection. I'm not going to say it's going to go to zero, but after the time and effort to plan a vaccine protocol and to buy the vaccines, let's use them in the best way possible.
So the modified live, and you stimulated a couple questions I want to. So the modified live, when you're talking about those, you're talking about a vaccine that comes in two components. It's got a liquid and there's a powder part, and you mix them together.
That's correct.
Right? How long is that good for? So if I keep it protected, as you suggested, keep it out of the sunlight, put it in the fridge, can I use some today, some tomorrow?
That would be great, but that's not a good idea. So really, once it's mixed up, you've got a few hours of good efficacy, but overnight you're really going to lose a lot, maybe all of it.
So even if I keep it protected, those viruses are going to die off.
Right.
So I can't just mix it up and keep it indefinitely.
Yeah. You're definitely on the clock once you've mixed it up, and you need to use it within a timely manner. So, and by that I mean minutes to hours.
Yeah, and those temperature spikes are important for both modified live and killed. So maintaining that critical chain all the way through.
I just do that for all vaccines.
Absolutely.
Just to treat them all the same. That I'm going to keep them in a kind of a nice temperature range.
Now, what about on my modified live or my killed? So I'm doing vaccinations and I'm doing them in accordance with BQA procedures, and I'm changing needles once in a while. But can I give a vaccination and then go back into that vial with the same needle, or how should I do that?
No, that's another important part of both beef quality assurance, just to make sure that we don't contaminate the vaccine vial because as you poke a needle through skin, you're going to pick up some germs from that skin. So whenever I place a needle into a vaccine bottle, I want that needle to be a brand new one. So I don't want to take a needle that I've poked into animals, gone through their skin, and take that needle and put it into a bottle of vaccine.
What about just wiping it off with alcohol or Novosan and then putting it in my vaccine bottle?
I'd prefer that you not do that, Brad. No, basically, we do talk about using a wipe or something between cattle if we're going to reuse needles, or use a new needle for each calf. But still, when you go back into a bottle of vaccine, it needs to be a brand new needle.
And if you are wiping it off and it's a modified live vaccine, that can kill the vaccine also.
Yeah, so we like to. We like to avoid using some alcohol or Novosan, those types of things, with our modified live vaccine syringes and around them, because we're trying to keep them alive, the viruses alive.
Absolutely. And one of the best resources for vaccine handling, syringe handling, cleaning is the BQA information.
Yes.
And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So there's several good handouts there that talk about how to best handle those vaccines, and syringe cleaning we didn't get into, but is also really critical that we control that. So every part of the process, quality control, you're going to the work of vaccinating the calves, and you let off with it.
Let's get as much out of that. Let's get as much benefit out of that as possible.
Let's get as much benefit as we can. We have enjoyed having you here with us today. If you have questions, comments, anything you'd like us to address on the show, please email those to us at bci@ksu.edu, and we'd be happy to have you share this podcast with your friends. And we're on iTunes and Google Play, and you can also go on there and rate us if you enjoy the show. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
K-State's Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, and Brad White. And you can also listen to the entire podcast by going to beefcattleinstitute.org. Again, beefcattleinstitute.org. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, as the old adage goes, big crops keep getting bigger. That did hold up in the USDA's latest yield estimates released yesterday. The agency's forecast for corn yields increased by 2.9 bushels per acre. Soybean yields grew by 1.2 bushels per acre. The national average corn yield, now estimated by the USDA at 181.3 bushels per acre, production totaling 14.8 billion bushels. The yield and production estimate coming in above the range of the pre-report estimates. On soybeans, the USDA expects farmers to harvest an average of 52.8 bushels per acre. That would put production at 4.69 billion bushels, both in line with pre-report expectations. Those crop estimates were released in the USDA's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates and Crop Production Reports yesterday. The USDA's yield estimates did take field surveys into account. We'll get into the longer-term market implications of these new numbers with K-State's Dan O'Brien during Dan's weekly visit with us here tomorrow. The USDA Secretary is still hopeful for a new farm bill before the old one expires. However, many issues stand in the way yet. Here's an update from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
House and Senate conferees continue to try to meld the different House and Senate versions of the Farm Bill into one bill, one that each House could pass and the President sign. And Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue told visiting Farmers Union members Wednesday,
"Time is running short, as you know, to get this done by September the 30th, by the expiration time. I'm an optimist. I'm always hopeful, but we've got some real challenges that way. Certainly there is still a gulf between the House and the Senate."
The two bills differ on many issues, from conservation to payment limits to policies revolving around the SNAP or food stamp program, and time is running out.
We need that safety net out there that you all can depend on as you make plans for 19. The stress of the economics right now make those decisions even more critical. And we need some certainty about that.
But there's still uncertainty about whether a new farm bill can be done before it expires September 30th. Also uncertainty about whether the government will shut down September 30 over other budget issues. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
While welcoming the recent statements by Secretary Perdue that word on year-round sales of E15 was coming soon, a collection of farm and biofuel groups expressed cautioning that such a move, without changes to how the EPA has operated the renewable fuel standard, would end up negating the benefits from E15. With ethanol prices hitting a 13-year low and net farm income plummeting to half of the record $123 billion in 2013, such an announcement could not come at a more critical juncture for rural America, the groups said. Quoting again their letter, "However, we remain concerned that any benefit from year-round E15 sales and proper implementation of the RFS could be nullified if refiners are given further regulatory bailouts that undercut the spirit and the intent of the law," the letter read. Year-round sales of E15 and other mid-level blends in conventional gasoline markets and ensuring that the RFS blending requirements erased by small refinery exemptions are reallocated to larger refiners as required by law are two key actions needed given the current climate, the groups said in this letter to President Trump. The groups added that both biofuel producers and farmers are suffering and that thousands of manufacturing and farming jobs in America's heartland are now at risk due to the EPA's recent mismanagement, they said, of the RFS and the delay in removing the de facto summertime ban on E15. Citing the 2.25 billion gallons of biofuel demand destruction, they say, created by the small refiner waivers, it is rural America's turn to get its end of the deal. Now, unless the EPA changes the way it considers small refinery waiver requests to the RFS, the ethanol industry could continue to suffer major market losses in the years to come. That's according to the University of Missouri's Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute published update to its 2018 U.S. baseline outlook for agricultural and biofuels markets. The economists at FAPRI conclude that the industry could lose about 4.6 billion gallons of domestic demand and almost $20 billion in lost sales revenue in the next 6 years if the agency continues to grant waivers at its current rate. Coming your way next, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi. Greg?
Aaron Murray is a middle school teacher in the Shawnee Mission School District who joins us. And Aaron, you've also participated in the Kansas Soybeans as a Food Facts program. What is the purpose of the Kansas Soybeans as a Food Facts program?
I believe it's an opportunity for us as facts teachers to be provided with soy products and teach our students about the benefits of using soy, the versatility of soy, and how we can incorporate it into our diet.
What got you interested in participating in the program?
As most schools are, we're very limited. We have a food budget, but it's always tight, and the Soy Council is very generous in helping us offset some of our expenses if we're willing to participate and use some of our soy products.
How did you incorporate this into your lesson plans for the students?
We had an opportunity to use soy products. We were able to substitute products that we would often buy, like regular milk, and we'd substitute it with soy milk. And we would use tofu. Oftentimes, one of my students' favorite things to make was a tofu manicotti. And we just learned to substitute a lot of other foods for soy products. Soy products are a chameleon food. They absorb any of the flavors that one might incorporate in with baking or cooking. We also talked a lot about the health benefits of using soy. It's high in protein, it's healthy, and that's a portion of how we used it.
The deadline for the Fall Facts program is coming up very soon.
If there are any facts teachers that are listening, the deadline is September 21st, and it's just as simple as filling out a request at the council, letting them know how many students you have, and then you keep the receipts, and then the Soy Council will reimburse you at the end of the semester. And they're really quite very generous in the products that they will reimburse you for.
Why is it important to teach students at this particular age the importance of food like soybeans?
I think a lot of the choices that they make early in life tend to stay with them for the rest of their life. And I just feel it's imperative, really, that we teach and demonstrate good health choices for young people. Because as I often say to my students, you put junk in your body, you're going to have a junky body. Maybe not right now, but certainly down the line. We know so much that there's a connection between what we eat and our health.
That is Aaron Murray, who is a middle school teacher in the Shawnee Mission School District, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Next up for you on Agriculture Today, more from the lawn and garden world, for it's our weekly K-State horticulture segment. And yes, we are now starting to edge into more fall-like conditions, thankfully. Still, we see insect activity aplenty in our landscape settings, and we brought by, once again, Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, to pass along the latest that he's observing out there. Want to mention something we brought up last time, but noting that they're still around, this has been a banner year for monarch butterfly activity. Raymond.
Yes, it has, Eric, and that's, the monarch butterflies, of course, are on the decline for many reasons, but we've seen a lot of the larvae. In fact, some of the larvae are still out there, the typical yellow, black-striped larva. Sometimes they can reach up to 2 inches in length. And then you'll see this light green chrysalis, which is basically the cocoon. That's where the larval tissues degrade, and then you get the beautiful adult that comes out afterward. But no, this has been a really banner year. People are planting more plants, milkweeds, for the monarchs, and as they make their way down south again for the winter.
So how long will they hang around, so to say?
Well, it varies, but of course they're on the way to Mexico, so maybe it'll be a week or two, basically, as they make their trip down. And so, be cognizant of these caterpillars. Don't pick them up or anything like this. Leave them alone. Use them as an educational tool, and just watch the monarchs as they make their way back south.
You wanted to share a word about an insect that folks may not be utterly familiar with, and it does have something of an ominous name, Scolia dubia. Is that right?
Yes, Scolia dubia is actually a parasitoid of the green June beetle larvae that reside in the turf grass, and kind of dark bluish in color. And there are 2 yellow dots on the both sides of the middle of the abdomen, and you'll see them feeding on wild onion, wild garlic, and goldenrod, along with some of the others we'll talk about today. But you just leave them alone. And they're not like cicada killers either. They're not going to get in your face. They're just feeding on the pollen nectar as a food source. But this year was a really banner year for green June beetles. And consequently, whenever you have high numbers of the pest, we tend to have high numbers of the natural enemies.
This is totally harmless as an insect would go. It's causing no trouble whatsoever then, except for the green June beetle.
Well, I wouldn't grab a female because they will sting you, but they're not aggressive. They're not going to attack you like a cicada killer male, get in your face and want to attack you like a yellow jacket. They're just out right now for the pollen nectar, and then they'll overwinter as a cocoon in the soil.
So they'll hang around flowering plants
exactly
for the remainder of the fall.
Right. Wild garlic and onion are blooming, and you'll see what I call hordes of these Scolia dubia adults feeding on the pollen nectar.
Well, we want to talk once more about bagworms, not necessarily this being the season for controlling those on our landscape evergreens, but you say the male bagworms are on the move, Raymond.
Yes, because we had so many bagworms this year, Eric. There's a lot of these males, and I've never seen as many males this year as we've had. But if you come up to a bag of a bagworm and you see a transparent case at the very base, that's where the male comes out. And I've been fortunate to actually see a male come out of that pupa. Now, they're a black, ugly-looking moth, actually, and their only desire after that is to mate with the female, then die. Now, remember, by mating with the female at that point, then later on, that female is going to lay between 500 to 1,000 eggs, and that's a little overwinter, and that's why we recommend hand-picking between now and then springtime. But if you're ever out looking at a tree that's heavily infested, look at the base of the bag. And if you're lucky, you might see these black male bagworms hanging around.
And those would be indicative of bagworms established on that evergreen. And you might want to look a bit harder for the bag itself and remove accordingly.
That's right.
Now, tell us about something called the goldenrod beetle, and it's prominent now. What's the story here?
Yeah, the goldenrod soldier beetle is a group of soldier beetles that we have in Kansas, both in the east and west. They basically are hanging on goldenrod right now. They love goldenrod. It's blooming. They also feed on wild onion and plants like that. And their orange body, they have black stripes. And, of course, this is, insects are extremely efficient. You'll see them eating. You'll see them mating simultaneously. Insects don't waste time, but they're really all over the place, hordes of them. They are predators. They will feed on, aphids and soft-bodied insects. But right now they're just trying to gather a lot of pollen nectar from goldenrod or solidago plants.
And those are the exclusive plants on which they stay then? They don't go very much further than that?
I have seen them on wild onion along with the Scolia dubia, but again, you go out to the gardens and, most of the goldenrods in bloom are going to have these goldenrod soldier beetles feeding.
Seems as if we're seeing a great deal of insect activity, Raymond, but the overarching story here is that these aren't causing any concern whatsoever, virtually none of them.
Absolutely not. This is the time of year we start seeing, and it's basically a consequence of the high numbers of insects we had, Japanese beetle, green June beetle, and bagworms. You have higher populations of their natural enemies, other insects that may serve as they were a food source for. So, yeah, this is a year you see parasitoids, and some of these insects could come into your home, but generally they don't stay because the humidity is too low. But this time of year we see some, the Scolia dubia, the goldenrod soldier beetles, and a whole slew of other insects that people don't realize are out there.
And saying that because one might want to think about that instead of inadvertently spraying against these insects. You want to preserve them because they are beneficials for the most part.
Right, and that's why we try to promote this conservation biological control where you put in plants that are blooming right now that will provide a pollen nectar source, a place to mate, a microhabitat for them to survive, so they will make it through the wintertime.
Well, if you'd like to learn more about preserving beneficial insects in the home landscape, you can turn to the extension resources out of K-State and have your questions answered there and anything else having to do with insects in lawn and garden. Right, Raymond?
Yeah, and I'll actually have an article on Scolia dubia and the goldenrod soldier beetle in our next issue of our newsletter coming out at the end of this week. Yeah.
Once again, Raymond, thanks for coming over. We'll have you back soon, for we've still some growing season left and plant activity likewise. So we will also, in concert with that, have insects around, and we'll talk about them then. Appreciate your time.
Look forward to it again, Eric.
He is Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. And that is for you this week's K-State Horticulture segment. And to cap off today's edition, this reminder to listen to the podcast version of our broadcast. Simply visit agtoday.net. Also, you can use your podcast app on your mobile device. Type in these search keywords, Agriculture Today, Kansas. You'll find the program right away. You just tap the subscribe button there, and new episodes of the broadcast automatically will arrive on your device every weekday. agtoday.net to look further into that option. In the meantime, please rejoin us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.